Um, Great. Welcome everyone to North Brooklyn DSA's Night School. This is the first session of our spring semester. I am Steve. I am on the North Brooklyn Political Education Committee. We do this every year, sort of as a forum for people in DSA to learn and teach each other about issues of note, to do a little theory alongside our praxis. Tonight we're going to be touching on the perennial subject of housing, a topic we all know close to our hearts as New Yorkers. Housing is a human right, as the slogan goes, but as we know here in the United States, that's not really formally recognized. So how are democratic socialists supposed to think about this in 2022? Where do we go from here? What is in our toolbox to decommodify housing, both in the near and long term? To answer that, we have Sam Stein. Sam writes about the politics of urban planning in New York City, with emphasis on housing, real estate, labor, and gentrification. His work has been published in The Guardian, The Village Voice, Jacobin, and many other magazines, websites, and other edited volumes and scholarly journals. Let's see. He's been reviewed in The New Yorker, the LA Review of Books, Architectural Review, and many more. In 2019, let's see if I get this to work. Can't really see it. This is his book. I apologize. He published his magnum opus, Capital City, Gentrification in the Real Estate State with Verso. He is a member of the steering committee of the Planners Network, an organization of progressive planning. Now, Sam Stein, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Steve, for the introduction and for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. I met with the North Brooklyn chapter after the book came out. We had a really nice discussion in a library community room in Bed-Stuy. I'm sorry we're on Zoom now instead, but I appreciate the chance to be back. The housing question is a huge topic really, and I can only take on some of it today. I don't know if I'm going to do justice to all the topics Steve brought up, but that's what the Q&A is for. So I'm happy to expand more. And of course, I'm not representing DSA positions here. Certainly not representing my employer or anybody else. This is sort of where I'm at right now as I think and reevaluate as things change. So I thought I'd start with some statistics to present the contours of housing unaffordability in New York City, which I know I don't have to convince anybody of. You all pay it every month, but just to get some ideas. So the New York City housing sphere is about 67% tenant, 33% owner. That's the inverse of the ratio in the country as a whole. In the country as a whole, we're about 2/3 owners, 1/3 renters. We are the reverse of that in New York City. New York State is somewhere in between, 46% renter, 54% owner, a little closer to balanced. New York renters, a majority, according to a 2017 survey, are rent burdened, paying more than 30% of their income in rent. At least 2 million New Yorkers every month are paying a majority of their income in rent. Over the last few years during the de Blasio era, our former mayor would tell us the rent burden went down a little bit, or the number of people who are rent burdened went down by about 6%, which is movement in the right direction. But if you look at the rent burden for low-income people, it stayed exactly the same throughout his mayoralty. So housing prices came down at the top much more than they came down at the bottom, where most of us are living. The threat of eviction is really severe right now. There are about 200,000 eviction cases on file on the books right now in New York State, with about 80,000 in New York City alone that have been filed since March 2020, when an eviction moratorium went into place. The state let that moratorium expire a couple of weeks ago without passing any meaningful new protections, which means hundreds of thousands of people are at risk of eviction and potentially homelessness. According to data from last summer, more than a quarter of low-income tenants were behind on their rents. And that was deeply skewed by race and also by gender, with women-headed households of color extremely high represented on being behind on rent and therefore vulnerable to eviction now that the moratorium is gone. There's about 60,000 people in the New York City shelter system right now, plus an unknown 1,000 numbers on streets, subways, and in other unstable housing conditions. The remarkable thing is that's actually down from pre-pandemic times, but it's really fucking high, and it shows, it shows that if you stop evicting people for a couple of years, homelessness stops growing, and we can actually do something about it. So the question that I was asked to talk about most of all is, why is the housing market unable to adequately address housing needs? Or in other words, how did we get to the point where all the facts that I just laid out are the case? There's a mainstream explanation, of course, which is that there's not enough supply to meet demand. There's not enough housing supply to meet demand for housing. And I think I used to be much more dismissive of that claim, but we have to take it seriously. We have to understand what's meant by that and separate it from anybody's feelings about who's saying it and how and why they might be saying it, including myself. So what do we mean, or what do they mean when they say there is not enough supply to meet demand? Let's start with the demand side. Why is demand growing for housing in New York City? The first thing to note is that job growth in New York City is much faster than in the surrounding region. Maybe in the immediate surroundings, it's also growing, but in New York State overall, there's a whole lot of decline that has intensified over the last couple decades. This is what we Marxists call uneven development, and it means that a lot more people are moving to New York City to find work than can find it elsewhere. And a lot of cities like New York City have the same thing. And at the same time as there is that economic driver, there's also cultural shifts in people's values around success and desirability. Whereas it used to be considered, a marker of success to move out of the city and into the suburbs, it's now considered a marker of success in many places culturally to move from the suburbs into the city. We also have far more two-commuter households, and environmental consciousness and other things that make people not necessarily want to live in separated suburban homes that were designed with a very different family unit and ideal in mind. Of course, COVID changed a bit of that, but I don't think it changed it irreparably. And of course, New York City remains a continued pull for international and internal migrants of various class strata, including some of the richest and the poorest. So that's the demand side. So what do they mean when they say the supply side isn't enough? That there has to be enough housing in the abstract, what they very anodyne call units of housing for everybody as that population is growing or as that demand is growing. And if the population grows, and especially the population of renters grows, but there isn't more housing, then tenants have weak bargaining power relative to landlords. It's actually the theory behind rent control and rent stabilization in New York City. That's what's written into the law as the legislative justification. And then implied and sometimes stated outright on people who make this claim is that government constraints, mostly zoning, and local opposition to construction mean that more people are competing for a steady, and in some cases shrinking, or in others not fast enough growing, number of housing so-called units. So that's the mainstream explanation, which I said I used to be completely dismissive, and I don't think that's useful. It's not totally wrong. The demand side stuff is certainly true, and I think most people agree on that. And the supply side stuff has some issues, but everybody should agree that it's certainly true in terms of the lack of growth and availability of housing that is affordable to those who need it, i.e. people who aren't making a ton of money. But there's more going on too. And that's where the book that Steve talked about, Capital City, spends most of its time. Sure, there's a supply and demand question in terms of people seeking housing and housing for people to move into, no question. But there's also several other things going on that we can understand as other kinds of supply and demand factors. There is the supply of and demand for investment capital, corporate investment capital, institutional investment capital, sometimes even personal investment capital, seeking very high and very fast returns on investment. There's the supply of and demand for mortgage credit and low interest rates for wannabe homeowners, yes, but even more importantly, to landlords who are seeking to refinance their rental buildings, draw the equity out of it, and then use that money to either pocket it and make tons of profit or buy more and more buildings and consolidate the real estate industry even further. There is the supply of and demand for, a little bit more abstractly, public policy initiatives, and more concretely, public dollars to prop up speculative development schemes. Those are all supply and demand questions too. And so the way we got into this mess with all those statistics I listed up front is not only about mass consumer preferences, both for housing and against new construction, as it's often framed, but also about the changing political economy of the city, but also the political economy of the state, the country, and the world systems, and the rise of what I call in the book the real estate state within those spheres. The real estate state is the alliance of real estate capital and government toward the interest of raising the exchange value, the price, of land and property. It's not a new thing. We've had something that you could call the real estate state as long as there's been private property and states coexisting, and it's not all-encompassing. The argument is not the US is a real estate state or New York City is a real estate state. The real estate state exists alongside other things you might call the blank state. The carceral state is one that I think we're all familiar with. The element of the state that is locking people up and beating people in the streets. The warfare state we sometimes talk about. The welfare state we talk about as something that's been diminished over the last several decades. Right-wingers talk about the administrative state, by which they sometimes mean the entire state, but all of these things are coinciding in one's worldview of how the state operates relative to capital. And I'm arguing that the real estate state has been there all along, but it's become increasingly important during the neoliberal era. To understand why that is, we need to understand the gentrification we're experiencing in New York City as a historical and material process. So I like to say that gentrification should be understood as the third stage in a three-step process of capital moving through space. The first step is investment, which is when capital is invested into a place and its building and housing stock. The next stage, many decades later, is disinvestment, when capital is pulled out of a place and moved elsewhere in search of higher profits. The third stage is reinvestment, when capital is put back into the built environment in a place and users are charged more for the privilege of inhabiting them, i.e. gentrification. You can map that timeline of the flow of capital into and out of space against the flow of capital into and out of the manufacturing and distribution centers in New York City, which is something, again, I try to do in Capital City. The manufacturing sector in New York City was enormous. It was diverse. It employed millions of people. The initial challenges to the New York City manufacturing era start in the post-war era. They accelerate by the 60s with movement into the peripheral region, then movement to the south, then out of the country altogether. And it's influenced by both kind of pull and push factors. So on the pull side, of course, capital is seeking weaker regimes and organization of labor and is finding it first in the less organized suburbs, then in the Jim Crow South, and then in the global South. But you also have the push factors of planners closely aligned with the real estate sector, pushing industry out of places that they think they can turn into more profitable uses. And so the decline of industrial capital in New York City ends up producing three kinds of vacuums, which real estate capital fills in. There's an economic vacuum. who's going to produce the money that the city is going to run on? Who's going to employ the workers, which is not so much the real estate sector so much as the service sector, but closely related in New York City. Who's going to be the tax base? And that's where real estate, finance, and insurance really come in. There's a spatial vacuum, as in there were spaces of the city that used to be taken up for one use that once industry is gone, get to be repurposed for another. And you can think of vast stretches of the New York City waterfront as perhaps the most visible manifestation of this. Places like Long Island City, which were actively industrial not that long ago, are now the fastest growing housing production neighborhood in New York City and in much of the country. It's an enormous change. And then you have a political vacuum. It used to be that there was more division within the capitalist class of New York City over what they wanted from the state, with industrial capital and real estate capital sort of agreeing that they needed state coordination, but disagreeing sometimes on what that looked like. With industrial capital gone, real estate kind of runs the game and has become the dominant player in New York City, and to some degree for a long time anyway, in New York State, determining how the course of development goes, determining the way that the planning system looks, and over-determining anyway, the way that we all live and pay the rent every month. I would argue that those kinds of things I just talked about go a long way toward explaining the rise of the real estate state and the unaffordability crisis that we face in New York City. We should understand, though, what mechanisms the real estate state uses or relies on to achieve its mission of raising land and property values. You can think about the round after round of privatizations that we've seen. Most recently through the RAD program in public housing, putting public housing into private management and then suddenly releasing a whole bunch of public money that goes to the private managers. Through the controversy over restricted deed sales that we saw under the de Blasio administration, where properties that had some sort of supposedly permanent protection to them, like an AIDS hospice in the Lower East Side, get bought out by real estate developers who pay not only for the right to the property, but also the right to ignore the deed restriction that was put on it to make it this important social service. And we have the constant churn of public land being sold to private owners, which is perfectly legal in New York City. And I said sold, that's an exaggeration. Often the sale is for $1. So those privatizations are really important, but so has been the retrenchment of our rent laws up until 2019. Basically, these laws expired periodically, and every time that they did, especially in the 90s and early 2000s up to 2019, they would get weaker and weaker and weaker. And that gave owners of rent-stabilized housing, landlords, tremendous incentives, not only to raise rent, they always want to raise rent, but to churn tenants specifically, to get tenants in and out, because every time they did that, they could raise the rent a whole bunch. And then they could leave rent stabilization. And once rent stabilization is gone, they can charge whatever they want, which creates a real strong linkage between external change and local rents, which is to say, if the city invests in a neighborhood, if the city improves the transit, improves the schools, improves the parks, there's nothing to prevent the landlord from raising the rent as a result. That's not the case in a system with strong rent control. It is a case in New York City where we got rid of 200,000 units, units, apartments, homes that were rent stabilized that were then no longer. The real estate state also operates through tax policy. It's often noted that the federal government subsidizes homeowners through the mortgage interest tax deduction and other tools to a much larger degree than it subsidizes public and affordable housing. That's true at the federal level, but that's true locally too. The number one housing cost for New York City and New York State is a tax break called 421A, which mostly subsidizes luxury development. I've run the numbers myself. We spend more, or we lose more on 421A than we spend on any other single aspect of our housing system. that alone should be evidence of the continued existence of the real estate state. By the way, that law expires in June. We should all be fighting for it to be dead forever. And then there's zoning. Zoning fights are complicated, combustible, and I increasingly feel maybe not the best place to devote our time, but zoning are the rules about what can be built where that the city establishes. And the short version of a very complicated history and process is there's been a historical and ongoing pattern of downzoning blocks that are home to predominantly rich and white people, and upzoning blocks that are home to poor people and people of color, as well as industrial spaces. Upzoning means you can build more than is there now. Downzoning means you can't. So it's been a kind of racist and pro-rich people system for a very long time. It has extremely racist roots, and the rhetoric around it has changed, but some of the reality certainly has not. So what are the results of all that together? Obviously, those statistics I gave before about rent burden and about homelessness, but also new development that's aimed at the highest buyers, sometimes in the world, amidst overall price increases, and so a flood of new development that most New Yorkers can't afford. Why isn't that then making the city more affordable, right? We're adding supply, why isn't that balancing out? There are people who defend it and say that it is making the city more affordable. If this is success, I'd hate to see what failure looks like, but they say it would be even worse if we didn't do all that. Okay, fine, counterfactual, hard to prove. But I don't think we're gonna settle for that, right? So why hasn't the price of housing filtered or trickled down? Filtering is the theory that old housing tends to become cheaper over time. As new stuff is built, people who can afford to move out of the old housing move into the new, creating space in the old. That process, when it works, takes decades, like 30 years is usually the standard, at least a generation. So when you have a crisis right now, when you have 60,000 people in homeless shelters, 30 years is not going to cut it. So that's one thing. The other thing is gentrification does change all this because old housing is actually valued very high. So there's no natural law that's going to say that just because it's old, it's going to be cheaper. Some new construction isn't built to filter at all. If you think of those like sliver condos on Billionaires Row, that's never intended to become middle-income housing, let alone low-income housing. That's supposed to stay a high-value asset forever. That's its exchange value is its primary use value. We also have rich people gobbling up the existing stock of housing through multiple home ownership. You know, I own a condo in New York City and a condo in Vancouver and a condo in Dubai, and you know, I spend my time wherever I want. But also much more prosaically, we saw in neighborhoods like the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side, the housing stock actually shrink because everybody is buying their neighbor's apartment when it goes vacant and combining the units together. We also have people buying up apartment buildings and converting them into single family homes, especially in some of the downzone neighborhoods, which also reduces the supply even if we're adding it. And it tends to reduce the supply of low income housing. It's like the rooming houses, the cheap housing that gets converted into those single family houses. So then there's just even more stock of expensive housing. There is, of course, the alternate hypothesis, which is that we would need to build way more than we're seeing, and that's the problem. What that looks like, who does the building, where, how rents would be set, and etc., should all be up for debate among proponents of this theory. And the answers to those questions are going to vary widely and matter a great deal. So the word supply isn't all encompassing, I guess is what I'm saying there. It could mean a hell of a lot of different things, and we should be involved in that debate. I was also asked to talk about this issue of vacancy. So we've seen actually a growing amount of vacancy at the top of the market, the real estate market in New York City, but declining vacancy at the bottom, which is not helping us. So I don't have a ton of time for this, but if you run the numbers, and I can get into this maybe in the Q&A if people want, the vacancy rate for apartments over $2,000 increased in the last several years as the vacancy rate for apartments under $1,000 went down significantly. Similarly, the number of homes renting for more than $1,500 went up 17%, as the number renting for less went down 14%. But the population who needs apartments at that lower level increased by 5%. So like, we do have population growth among people who need a certain kind of housing, and it's not being produced. There is a lot of intentional emptiness in New York City. In fact, it increased 35% from 2014 to 2017. There are about 250,000 apartments that are sitting vacant. There are 4 types of vacancy though, so it's not all one thing. There are market fuck-ups, where somebody built something and thought they could sell it or rent it, but they can't. There's not actually a ton of that, but there is some. Then there's kind of the opposite of that, which is intentional vacancy, which are apartments that are bought and unoccupied. So people bought them as an investment vehicle, not to live in, or they live in them for a couple weekends a year, and that's it. So from the owner's perspective, that housing is working out just fine. From the resident's perspective, it's a waste of space. Then you've got apartments that are technically vacant, but are being used as short-term rentals. Airbnb is the most famous example of that, but you also have like corporations that rent out apartments for visiting, traveling business people that sit vacant a lot of the time, but are there when one corporation needs them. And then finally, you have landlords who are warehousing apartments, either taking the depreciation on them or hoping that the rent in the future could be higher than it is right now. You also have what tenant organizers are calling Frankensteining of apartments, which is intentionally keeping an apartment vacant. And then when the apartment next door becomes vacant, when out, the landlord combines the 2 apartments into one. And the reason that they do this is to get out of it. It's one of the remaining loopholes in the rent stabilization law. They can set the new rent for this newly combined apartment at whatever the market will bear. So all 4 of those types of vacancies are combining into that 250,000 vacant apartments, but it is a hell of a lot of vacancy for an extremely tight housing market. So why do we have, like that kind of vacancy at the same time as housing is extremely constrained? Because that's what's working for the market, and that's what the laws are allowing, is the shortest version of that. People are making money through 3 out of those 4 types of vacancy. The only one they're not making money off of is the market fuck up, where they built it and they really thought they could sell or rent it, but they can't. And that doesn't happen all that often. Then how am I doing on time? I'm probably close to the end.
Oh yeah, you have about, let's say, another 5 minutes.
Cool. I'll speak real quick and maybe get into it more in the Q&A about what happened under de Blasio. He likes to say that there was more affordable housing production under his mayoralty than any other mayor. And that's true. There really was. And yet rent burdens did not fall for low-income New Yorkers. Displacement and gentrification continued. And there was still far too little housing being produced that was aimed at the lower income New Yorkers, who are by far the most rent burdened, the most overcrowded, and the most at risk of eviction and homelessness right now. So there was a lot of new affordable housing that was produced. A lot of that was re-subsidizing affordable housing whose affordability would expire otherwise. So we're in this sort of constant scheme of bailing out housing that we've subsidized in the past. There was also new production, but like I said, it didn't go to the lowest income New Yorkers, and it just doesn't come close to the scale that we need. So none of this is justification to, say to fight new housing production for the sake of fighting new housing production, but it's an explanation of what's going on in this city and why the kind of production that we've seen hasn't done anything for most of our rent burdens. So I want to close saying there's no way out of this. There's no other road but class struggle, essentially. And that class struggle can sometimes feel separate from the housing sphere, but it really shouldn't. And we should understand housing struggle in New York City and everywhere else as really important within the current configuration of the capitalist system. Tenants right now have a really important structural position in urban capitalism. More and more money is being invested in urban real estate than ever before, all under the proposition that rents and prices can keep going up and up and up and up without stop, and that people will move out or be pushed out or suffer and just pay more until they can't anymore. If tenants can put a wrench in that system, they're not just frustrating a landlord. If they do it at scale, they are frustrating an entire regime of accumulation that has put in a historic amount of money into that proposition. Homeless New Yorkers really need to be a part of this as well. Like I said, 60,000 people in the shelters. That is a tremendous number of people who can be mobilized and who inspire a visceral fear in a lot of people with a lot of power. I think we can think about, we probably all agree that we need to be moving toward a system of social housing instead of a system of market housing. How do we get from here to there with like the 2 minutes I have remaining? Obviously, the clearest route is through public takings, buyouts, tax foreclosures, and then sponsored redevelopment. Yes, we should do that. That will take money, which means restructuring the tax system and imposing fines and fees on landlords and speculators and other rich people. But none of this happens without organizing. There's no way to get to the first step without a massive amount of organizing, which means strengthening tenants' rights, because tenants can't and won't organize without strong legal backing around them. And then finally, tenants need legal leverage and economic pressure to take over their buildings, which means tougher building codes and enforcement. There are liberal versions of some of these things, of building codes, of tenants' rights legislation. Certainly there was some horrible versions of public takings in US history, but there are radical versions of all these things. And if we combine them together, we could get a pretty interesting program of eventually large scale transformation and conversion of private housing into public and social housing. So in conclusion, we have to understand the structural nature of the problem we face in order to understand why we haven't won already and why things haven't gotten better on their own, and to plot a way forward. And like I said, that way forward is now and always class war. Thanks a lot.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sam. We're going to go to Q&A shortly, but first, I'm going to turn it over to Doug, who will do the community agreements.
Thank you, Sam. That was terrific, as I expected, of course. Let's see. We have a ritual of reciting our community agreements, what the ground rules for these sorts of Q&A discussions. They're pretty simple. Just assume that good faith on the part of your interlocutors. Everybody is here to learn and treat each other like comrades and not like on Twitter. We have a progressive stack to handle the questions. If you have a question, type the word stack into the chat and we will call on you. And try to be brief. We would like to have as many people as possible get the word in. So, and if you've spoken before, try not to speak again. If you're haven't spoken before, don't be shy, speak up. Okay.
Thank you, Doug. I think we're going to shift it now to Mia, who will handle stack.
So did we say we're going to kick off the conversation just with a couple of questions from political ed, or do we want to take it as they come, Steve?
I'll say I'll throw it open to the committee to speak now or hold your peace. Doug, would you like to ask a question?
Okay. Well, a sociologist friend said she wanted to ask a friend of hers who worked as a legislative staffer in Albany, writing real estate legislation, to come to her class and explain how it all worked. His answer was, I could do it, but it would take only 30 seconds. We wrote whatever it was that real estate told us to do. Was that true? Have things changed dramatically in Albany with the socialist takeover of the legislature? How much truth is in that statement?
It's a good line. And I think there is certainly a kernel of truth in it. The real estate industry has had tremendous sway in Albany for a very long time. I would also say that they have less sway now than they have had in some previous eras. So let's just go back a little bit. In the time when there was Republican control of the state Senate, Democratic control of the Assembly, and then back and forth, mostly Democrat, but sometimes governor, sometimes Republican governors, the real estate industry did extremely well, capturing basically all three of those bodies, being a tremendous donor, and essentially giving allowances to the Assembly Democrats to pass whatever they wanted with the knowledge that the Senate would always stop it. And that was the deal that everybody understood. New York City real estate folks would give a tremendous amount of money to upstate legislators who had, famously when I started as a tenant organizer, I can't remember her name, but the chair of the state Senate Housing Committee, we always used to say this, had more cows in her district than renters. And she didn't give a shit at all about renters, and all the money that was in the budget would go to homeowners of various kinds. And it worked that way for a very long time. And like I said, every time the rent laws came up for renewal, they were dialed back, and we were, lucky just to have them, even though they got weaker and weaker and weaker. That is not exactly how things are right now, for a couple reasons. One, as you said, there are 6 DSA state assembly and senators, which changes things quite a bit. They have a number of people who aren't DSA backed, but are voting like them and doing a lot of the work behind the scenes. So that's great, to the point that the state legislature is probably a better vehicle for at least progressive change than the city council has been. We'll see if that changes now. And that hasn't really been the case for a very long time. The other thing that's interesting is it feels like the New York real estate community, the industry is a little bit more internally divided on some key issues, with the landlords and small homeowners on one side, or the smaller landlords and homeowners on one side, and the bigger developers on another. And to give some practical examples here, the big developers don't really care at all about good cause eviction protections. They're not the ones who are out fighting it. It's the small landlords who are really putting up a fight around that piece of very important legislation. Meanwhile, the small landlords don't care at all about 421A, the giant tax break for luxury development, but the biggest developers do. And so it's useful, it's productive for us that the real estate industry is somewhat at cross purposes. And I think we would better our analysis by understanding them as divided, as well as us as, divided the way that we always are.
Awesome, thank you. And just a reminder, I think Doug already covered this, but we'll ask people to keep their questions to about 2 minutes. That should be plenty of time. We'll see how that goes. And next on stack, and Carrington, I think you're going to be the one giving a heads up if someone is running out of time. And we have Alex next on stack.
Thank you, Mia. I only need 30 seconds. So, hey, Sam, it's good to see you on the Zoom. Back in early December, you were on another Zoom where you talked about retrenchment, and I heard you say the word again. So would you mind, defining it again? And then the second thing, totally separate, is would it be too intrusive to ask how you know so much about social housing? Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I often talk about rent law retrenchment. I don't know where I came up, why that's the phrase that I always repeat, but it is what I say. And what I mean by that is the rent laws in New York State, which govern New York City, Nassau County, Westchester County, and Rockland County would have a sunset on them. So they'd be passed and renewed for 5 years, and then they'd be passed and renewed for 3 years, and then they'd be passed and renewed for 6 years. And every time that came up, tenants would mobilize in Albany and make a big fight. And there would be negotiations with the 3 men in a room, the governor, the head of the Senate majority, Republican, head of the Assembly majority, Democrat, and they would come to a deal. And the deal would be, you won again, tenants, there's still rent stabilization, but landlords, don't worry, we also, weaken them a little bit. And they would do this over and over and over again. And by the end of it, there were so many loopholes written into the rent laws that it was very possible for landlords to take apartments out of rent control or rent stabilization and make them market rate. And as you know, Alex, as we've talked about, the remaining way that some landlords can do this has to do with 421A, because there are some circumstances where a 421A apartment can be deregulated, even though after 2019, the rest of the rent stabilized housing stock has to stay rent stabilized. That's a massive carve out for big developers. And your second question was, how do I know what I know about social housing? And I can say, from study is one, from organizing is the second, and then the third is that I live in a form of social housing, which is a limited equity cooperative. And to give the short version of my building, it's in Hell's Kitchen, and it's 8 buildings where the landlord fell way behind on his taxes and let the buildings fall apart. And in 1979, the city of New York foreclosed on the properties, fixed them up over the course of 2 years, and then sold them back to the tenants for an average of $510 per apartment. They kept them. They can then sell them, but they have to sell to people under a certain income bracket. And they have to give back half of the profit to the co-op to keep it affordable. That's the model. That is one model of kind of actually existing social housing that exists to a fairly large degree in New York City. Of course, the biggest form of social housing we have is public housing, New York City Housing Authority housing. There's also Mitchell-Lama cooperatives, which is a form of housing produced in mostly the 60s and 70s in New York State, that are also limited equity co-ops, and are actually much better regulated than the kind that I live in, which were mostly produced in the 80s.
Okay, next on stack, we have Kay.
Hi, thanks so much. This was extraordinarily informative. I have an organizing question. You talked both about the necessity for tenants to organize to jam up the gears of the real estate state. And you also talked about all of these different really critical policy changes that we kind of need, like a social movement sort of sufficient to implement. And I'm just kind of looking at the state of tenant organize, or like say like housing organizing in New York State. There can seem to be sometimes a bifurcation where some people work a lot on the housing policy side and some people work a lot on the tenant organizing side. And sometimes there's a sinew, but there's not necessarily. And some of the people who are doing one or the other aren't necessarily talking to each other or actively interested in what's going on, although they are sort of supportive and on the same side. So I guess I'm kind of curious what you see as the kind of way to put these different organizing paths kind of together into the social force we need.
Yeah, that's a good and daunting question. The first thing that comes to mind is this is probably not a problem unique to the housing sphere. That I think it happens in a lot of different kinds of organizing, where you've got like shop floor organizing in labor, and then you've got like a separate sphere of people who are working on labor policy, and the two don't necessarily always mix. But you certainly have it in New York. I think that's absolutely an accurate depiction of it. When I was trained as an organizer, the way that the model was, you organize a building at the level of the problems that they're facing right now, which might be economic, it might be rent hikes and evictions, it might be building conditions. whatever it is, and you get people together and you keep doing that, and then you get people to know their neighbors, and then you figure out what are the commonalities between them, and then you get people to then fight for a policy that would address the commonality. And if you're doing good, political education at the same time, you're showing that we're not just fighting to win this one thing, it's what would winning this one thing enable us to get if we keep growing and growing and organizing and organizing. I think that's a pretty good model. I think some of the vehicles we have to do it, some of the nonprofits are pretty well captured by the restrictive nature of that field. But I will say that the more organizations we have that are outside the traditional nonprofit schema, the better the nonprofits actually have gotten, because they're not the only game in town. They can look bad compared to other groups that are making more radical and often more sensible demands than they're willing to make in their conception of what is common sense. So I think there are things we can take from that model without being restricted by the form itself.
Clifton?
Hey Sam, thank you. Thanks for taking my question. Well, the question is, well, Bill de Blasio is no longer in the mail, so now we have a new mail. So now we have a new mail. It's Eric Adams. So my question is, have you hear about Eric? Have you heard Eric Adams announcing about this house, about the polo house?
Yeah, I mean, it's not encouraging necessarily. This is a guy who proclaimed during the primary, when asked about his connections to real estate, he said, "I am real estate." So he understands these things. He also knows better than that. He knows the difference between somebody who owns a home and somebody who's a massive real estate developer, but he's very good at eliding that difference, right? When people asked him about the rent freezes from the Rent Guidelines Board, which was possibly the most important and successful thing that Bill de Blasio did, from my perspective, was appointing members to the Rent Guidelines Board who passed 3 years of rent freezes. When asked if he would do the same, Eric Adams said, not unless there's going to be a mortgage and tax freeze for owners. And then he defended that by saying that Black and immigrant homeowners need protections too, knowing full well that that is not who owns rent stabilized housing in this city. And so I think he's very good at what he does. I think there are certain issues where we might find a more willing audience than Bill de Blasio, but on the big picture, it's going to be a fight, as it should be, right? That's what we're here to do. We're here to fight with power. We're here to take power, and then we're here to use that power once we have it. So I'm not afraid of the Adams administration. I think it is mostly more of the same, but it's the same as it ever was. We know what to do.
Okay, and I'm gonna skip over myself because my question was actually very similar, and go to Carrington.
Could I ask a slightly two-part question, which is, I missed that you were saying when you were talking about market housing to social housing and how we get there, you actually listed off like 3, 4, 5 things, but kind of rapidly. And I wondered if you could repeat that. And then I have a question on top of that. Do you mind answer that first?
Yeah, let's do that first. So what I can preview here, that what I was talking about there is something that I've been working on with 3 friends, and will be releasing in a short form and a long form probably in a couple months. But the question is, like, what is the pathway to social housing from a mostly private but mixed market system that we have right now to a system of converting to social housing? And what I said was, the clear pathway is public takings, buyouts of private property to make them public, tax foreclosure, like what happened in the building that I live in, and then either owning them as public entities, giving them to the tenants to operate as limited equity cooperatives or other social housing models, or if it's vacant land, publicly sponsored new development. But that's kind of the end. So to get there, what I said is you need money, which means that we need to completely rethink the tax system, which right now is giving $1.7 billion to luxury developers every year through the 421A tax break. And we need to be, taxing the rich and imposing fees and fines on speculators and evictors and the like. And then I said, but none of that happens without organizing, right? The government doesn't socialize itself. So in order to build organizing, we're going to need more tenants' rights, more legal protections for tenants, so that more tenants can comfortably join the movement and not be afraid that they're going to be very summarily dismissed from their housing as a result. And then finally, I said tenants need legal leverage and economic pressure if they ever want to take over their buildings, which can mean tougher building codes and enforcement of those codes. So basically making it illegal to keep collecting rents while maintaining bad or even deadly housing conditions. With those things in place, possibly in reverse order of how I said it, we could potentially have movement toward social housing. Nothing is guaranteed. None of it happens if there isn't tremendous organizing, building up of state power, taking the steps to get there. But that's kind of one way of how we could get from here to there. I think we're sometimes pretty good at our analysis of here. We're sometimes pretty good at what would we want there to look like. We're often not so great at the pathways in between. So it was just sort of somewhere between thinking out loud and summarizing stuff that I've thought about before about what those pathways could look like.
That's amazing. And I wonder if what you're living in is an HDFC, that's what I live in, but also if like what happened in Germany, the resolution in Germany for expropriating housing in Berlin, if that's something feasible we could do, or some sort of American spin on that. But you can go on to other questions. Maybe you could fit that into your answer somewhere.
I think we should all be inspired by what's happening in Berlin right now. My understanding is that all of that is formerly public housing that was privatized. And so taking back housing that we've privatized is what that would look like for us. We don't have the same constitutional mechanism that they have in Berlin, where the ultimate purpose of land is for the social good or something like that was written into the post-war constitution. So our legal process would look somewhat different. But yeah, we should all be inspired, and there's going to be an event. We were going to do it more recently, but the whole eviction moratorium stuff meant that it wasn't the time to do it. But we're going to have some organizers from Berlin and some social housing organizers in New York talking either in person, maybe at a movement space, or on Zoom. So I'll make sure that the organizers of this know when that's happening.
Isaac?
Yeah, hi Sam. This has been a very interesting talk. I think one thing I just want to reflect on is the, I think in DSA, I'm in the housing working group, I'm on the OC. I use it a lot, but you use it a lot, we all use it a lot, but like this kind of we pronoun, right? And I guess I just wonder, like, thinking how we can think about that alongside some of what you said, some of what you've written on, of like the kind of nonprofit capture or state, captured by the real estate of nonprofits. You have this really interesting case study of Asian Americans, AAFE, which was like started as a front group by a hardcore Maoist political party, and eventually is becoming this like awful slumlord. That would be something I'd be interested in hearing your reflections on, because you've listed all these things you say we need, like we need laws, things like that. But I also think to do that tenant organizing that you're talking about, we need like a new movement, a new like housing movement, or you know, some things have to change about it. And I think it's kind of relating to what you've said about like groups kind of on the outside shifting that housing movement. I think there's been really interesting work. The Jim and Bushwick did really interesting work on relating to homeless stuff that was really kind of working with and organizing alongside homeless folks instead of, you know, that kind of top-down relationship it usually is. There's been some very interesting stuff on squatting happening. I think there's been, you know, I think some nonprofits were really moved on the kind of question of responding to evictions after the eviction moratorium and the kind of lack of real preparation for what would happen afterwards. So I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about that history of the kind of housing movement that goes alongside this real estate history of like the 80s and 90s in New York. Like, what are these changes that are happening in the housing movement when you refer to as like the kind of capture of the nonprofits, and like how does that affect our organizing today?
Yeah, big question, important question. Let me think about how I want to answer this. So let me just start with the history, and we'll see where it goes from there. New York City has had a strong tenant movement for a very long time, right? We had huge rent strikes in the Lower East Side and Harlem and other places in the early 20th century that were an inspiration around the country and around the world. And in fact, some of those tenant strikes actually moved to other cities that took them up in solidarity and with their own demands. That spirit still animates the tenant movement in New York City, but it's also become much more staid in a way that's similar to, but also different from the labor movement, right? We also had a pretty radical labor movement at various times in this country and in this city in ways that right now have been fairly institutionalized and disciplined in a lot of ways. The housing movement capture is not the same as the labor movement capture, but I think it's a useful framework because a lot of this stuff happens in parallel. So a short summation of how we got to the point where we are right now, where nonprofit groups dominate the housing organizing world, and many of them are also nonprofit, usually affordable housing landlords, is that as part of the Great Society programs in the 1960s, the federal government put a bunch of money into community development corporations, which were sort of locally based initiatives to do a few things at once: to attract capital into disinvested neighborhoods and to organize around demands. And to do both things at once sets up a lot of contradictions, right? You know, the first one was the Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation, which Bobby Kennedy had a large hand in founding. And some of their first projects include like tenant organizing, but also bringing IBM in to do a tremendous amount of private investment. And so like immediately, what is this board and who is it accountable to and what is its idea of development becomes a question, and you have like radical groups critiquing them at the time. But that model builds and builds and builds, and it builds with the support of the Ford Foundation and with the support of the federal government, which especially after Nixon is actively disinvested from public housing as it's investing instead in these sort of alternative models, which they sell as, you know, local control, but are really extremely limited in what they're able to do. And you also have, you know, a little bit later, the development of independent nonprofit organizing projects, which are not affordable housing developers, which is sort of like the Acorn phenomenon and its spinoffs. I'm catching the chat. This is all accurate. Check out Top Down, it's a great book I heard about on Doug's show years ago. Anyway, you've got the Acorn universe doing a certain model of organizing, which is basically Alinskyite organizing, and then you've got the community development corporations replacing the role of the direct state provision of housing and instead being this nonprofit intermediary, but then also sponsoring a ton of organizing projects. So the landscape of tenant organizing today is really confusing if you don't know where to look. You have like genuine independent tenant unions springing up in neighborhoods all over the city. You have nonprofits that do only tenant organizing, right? Groups like the Met Council or Tenants and Neighbors that don't own housing. You've got nonprofit organizing projects that are sponsored by an affordable housing developer. So like CASA in the Bronx is a good example. It does really good, really important work. They are sponsored by New Settlement Apartments, the affordable housing developer. And then you've got groups that don't even have a firewall, like you mentioned, AFI, Asian Americans for Equality. And that's one that I've written about in various places that, like you said, started out as a Maoist organizing group, went on to become extremely tight with bankers, the Democratic Party, and developers as it is now. So that's kind of the landscape we have to work with, which is confusing, but I agree with you. I think those groups that are autonomous, that are independent, that are left, are pulling things in a different direction. I think DSA is a huge part of that. When I got started as an organizer, it was for one of these basically Alinskyite organizations that wasn't affiliated with Acorn or anything like that. It's Tenants and Neighbors. And we, the organizers, believed in universal rent control, but we couldn't go out and say that to Sheldon Silver and Vito Lopez as the thing we were fighting for in 2011. In 2019, that was the movement's demand. And the organization I used to work for, Tenants and Neighbors, was right out there up front saying universal rent control. And if it wasn't for groups like DSA and the Crown Heights Tenants Union and other organizations that are not beholden to the same finance and Democratic Party assholes as the rest of them, there's no way that would have happened. So it's certainly not a comfortable we of we're all in this together, but it's also not a inevitable road to ruin or something like that. Like there's a terrain to struggle for and win and push out the ones that need to be pushed out and capture the ones that can be captured.
Great. So in the interest of time, we want to make sure everyone gets to ask their question who's already on Stack. We're going to ask people to try to keep their question to 1 minute or less. So try to just ask your question and get straight to it so that other people have a chance to. So we're going to go ahead with Johnny.
Yes, thank you. I'm really not even sure what's the question. I really enjoy listening to you, reading your book. It's around nature. Nature to me represents the, everything that we need to do to fight for. And I'm wondering what advice you have for us as we think about nature.
Yeah, sure. Are you a NYCHA resident?
I am not, but I'm a former NYCHA resident, and I have family that lives there.
Yeah. I mean, NYCHA is an extremely important thing. First of all, it's just an important source of affordable housing. It's the single largest source of affordable housing in New York City. It keeps a lot of people out of poverty historically and now. And it's an example of publicly owned, publicly managed housing. I see we have Joshua Barnett, who works in public housing on the call. And so it needs to be defended. It needs to be improved and invested in, and it needs to be expanded. But that's a lot easier said than done. But fighting to make sure that that we get resources from the city government, from the state government, and the federal government is essential. Breaking the logic of RAD is also really important. We could spend an hour on this, but RAD is the Obama era program that allows public housing authorities to bring in private management. And then once they do, they get a bunch more money. They get more money from the federal government through various things, through Section 8 instead of Section 9 money, through low-income housing tax credits, and other public public dollars that are just not available to the public housing authority. And then the private manager can also, use the bond and mortgage market to leverage for even more. We can't have a system where the only way out of chronic federal underfunding is private management, at which point the federal government kicks in a bunch of money it was otherwise unwilling to pay. But there are a lot of public housing tenants who are for this program because it has promised them, a reinvestment. And so I am for ways to keep public housing public while bringing in far more money. And I think we should support NYCHA residents and allied organizations in the push for all those resources, and not allow for RAD to be the only way out. Because as long as that's the case, public housing will be seen as a failure and private housing will be seen as the solution, when in fact it's us diverting money to private housing that is the problem all along.
Okay. Shannon?
Hi. First of all, thanks for being here, and I loved your book. I'm part of a tenants union that we were really inspired to come together, or believed that we could do something based on your writing. So thanks for doing what you do. And I have our ultimate goal, we would love to, there's a lot of detail, but we would love to also become co-op owners and sorry, this dog. What do you know about the 7A program as being a path to both holding landlords accountable in this drive to get things fixed and hold landlords accountable? Also, Eric Adams, we worked closely with him when he was in the borough president's office, and he's actually the one who drove us towards the 7A program. And so I know that he believes in that. Is there any hope in using that as an organizing tool? I feel like it would really inspire tenants if they felt like there was a way out, something that they could do.
Yeah. You probably know more about 7A than I do at this point. I've never worked on a 7A campaign, but 7A is a legal form of receivership for buildings where the landlord isn't doing what they need to do to keep up the conditions. And so tenants can sue using 7A and basically get the state to name somebody else as the temporary owner of the building. The problem that tenants sometimes often run into, is that a 7A receiver is brought in, they fix up the building, and then when it's in good shape again, it goes back to the old owner. So what we need is mechanisms to prevent that, to either have the receiver become the permanent owner if that's what the tenants want, and that probably would be the case for a lot of tenants, or for those who want to buy it, funding to turn it into a limited equity co-op. So 7A reform is on the agenda of groups in the Bronx, I know. UNHP is one, University Neighborhood Housing Project, I think, something like that, UNHP. And they're working on some legal reforms around capture of 7A buildings. But then the other is TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which is a bill in Albany right now, which has some legs and is modeled after programs in Washington, DC, and some other parts of the country where when a building changes hands, the tenants have the first right of refusal. And they can either buy it themselves and get public funding if they'll turn it into a limited equity co-op, which means a cooperative owned by the residents without the ability to make a ton of profit, or they can designate a nonprofit buyer, which might be your 7A receiver. It might be a neighborhood organization that you trust, and you take it out of the hands of the private landlord once and for all, and that would kick in with every building transaction. So it would be not only a tool for taking housing away from bad landlords, but also slowing the churn of sales and speculative flipping that we've seen again and again and again, which always leaves tenants behind. So those are two kind of political vehicles that could be useful for you. But if the answer is to pursue 7A or not, if you've got a case, absolutely do it.
Okay. Yeah, we have lawyers that don't want to do it, and we were kind of wondering about it, but yeah, 7A. Okay, so 7A combined with TOPA would lead us there.
I think so. Alex,
Or lead everybody there.
Chat you should check out. But yeah, and there might be good reasons not to do 7A in your case. I don't want to say like I know better than your lawyers, that they've seen the building finances or whatever, but like it could work.
They haven't actually, so
that's the problem.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Alrighty, Joshua.
Hey Sam, how's it going?
Good to see you.
Great talk. Yeah, I always get writer's cramp when you talk. Being a letter, I use a pen. But I do have two quick NYCHA questions, actually, one more specific, but one kind of general. I'm picking up on what Johnny said. You know, I think most activists agree that RAD really does suck. You know, even Greg Rust, the head of NYCHA, admits that it's taking public housing off the public housing rolls. And he's been kind of, you know, the hired gun for about half a dozen cities just trying to destroy public housing. And the appeal is out of desperation. But for the remaining 2/3 of NYCHA units, they're going out for something called the Public Housing Trust. And that's actually been even more divisive. Of course, I think they kind of learned from their mistakes about, you know, full market infill housing on public land, and RAD. And now they're, you know, trying to say, well, don't worry, jobs, apartments, everybody's safe if we go to the Public Housing Trust. I don't buy it. To me, it's public housing light. And so, you know, because it's coming from the same group of people, the same group of the ruling class that does want to divest of public housing. So I really did want to know, but there's a lot of controversy about it. So I want to know like what you think.
Yeah, so you and I have talked about the preservation trust idea. To me, it's more a way out of the RAD problem than, you know, just another RAD. And I think it is only existing and on the table because of the struggles that public housing tenants have put up around RAD.
Right.
You know, it's kind of like when de Blasio started rezoning wealthier neighborhoods. Like whether we like that or not, he was only doing that because working class struggle had kept him out of any more poor people's neighborhoods. Right. So I think we need to recognize that the victory of closing off RAD as the big solution, even though that's the, you know, what this guy built his career on. Yeah. I mean, I think the preservation trust is worth talking about and debating. I don't think it should be written off. I think if it's a bit of a 3-card Monte with the federal government, where it's like we keep it public, but we get the money from the federal government as if we were a private organization. And in that sense, it's kind of playing games. But the federal government is not a reliable partner now, certainly, and it hasn't been for a very long time. You know, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema just kept us from getting billions of dollars into NYCHA. And so if there's another way to do it that keeps public housing public, I think it's worth discussing, debating, and hearing from public housing residents. Yeah, that's what I say.
Yeah. I mean, and the follow-up is, you know, again, this might be too big to get into now, but both RAD and PAC, their Orwellian euphemism, and the Public Housing Trust are about preserving public housing. But like you said, we need a lot more of it. Mm-hmm. One of the big organizing obstacles has always been that public housing, unlike a lot of things like public transportation or public health or public education, housing is accepted much more as a commodity generating entity than the public other entities like parks and libraries that most people accept as being public. That's kind of a tough road to hoe, because not even that ideology extends beyond even the neoliberals. So what kind of experience have you had just trying to break that down? Because that's you know, that's a tough one, actually. You know, people who want more public schools don't necessarily want more public housing, you know, but that is what we need.
Absolutely. And that's exactly the problem that I've run into a bunch, is that all these other public goods, nobody expects to individually make a profit from them, right? Like you might have good private healthcare, but you're not expecting it to turn you a profit unless you're, you know, an insurance magnate or something. And the same goes with public education, though I guess people use that as like a tool to get higher paying jobs or whatever. But yeah, housing is very much the opposite. One ray of hope, though, is that there is wide support for the idea of another Mitchell-Lama program. That support is, you know, from tenants who want to be in Mitchell-Lama co-ops, from Mitchell-Lama co-op owners who want more, you know, housing stock of that kind, both because they think it can work and because then they'll have more power, And even from Democratic politicians who would never say like, yeah, we need more public housing, they will say we need more limited equity co-op housing. And the thing is not to say, okay, so let's do Mitchell-Lama instead of public housing. I honestly think we should do both, but it's to say nobody thinks that they're making a profit off of that, and yet people recognize it as good. I think there's two problems with public support for more public housing. One is exactly what you listed, that people expect to make a profit off of it, and they won't in this case. That's one problem. But then the other is that they don't necessarily have faith in the model in the first place, and not without cause, because the system has been allowed to deteriorate such that it's really bad in some cases. In other cases, it's pretty nice, but in some cases, in a lot of cases, far too many cases, it's deadly. And so until we can get the conditions back in good shape for public housing, it's going to be really hard to convince a large number of people that that's a desirable model for themselves and their family, let alone for the broader society. I think the first one we can like the fact that people like the idea of Mitchell-Lama suggests that they could be okay with high quality public housing too, but we need to make public housing actually high quality for people to be able to believe that.
Okay, we have the last couple of questions to close out with Alec.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for your talk. So you said that big landlords don't care about good cause and small landlords don't care about 421A. I'm sure a lot of people here can answer this question, so sorry if it's ignorant, but how do you prioritize those two policy battles when you take into account the power that big landlords and small landlords have, the relief that each can put on the housing market, and like the path towards more socialized housing?
I don't think anybody can answer that question easily. It's a good question. And, you know, really we want to be doing both, and we have to be doing both in part because of the calendar that the legislature works on. If those two things are legislation that has to happen, the first deadline is the state's budget. Good cause eviction protections don't really cause money directly, though indirectly they kind of do, but they could still be put into the budget. We could put a bill abolishing 421A into the budget also. Also, the governor has put in her own proposal for replacing 421A, which she wants passed in the budget, and we don't know what the legislature wants to do. And so that budget is going to be a crucial terrain, and we're going to have to fight both at the same time. The simplest, probably best thing to do would be to push 421A out of the budget and say, we'll talk about that afterward. Don't put it in the budget. Don't count on it now. And let's fight for good cause and get that into the budget. Then after that's passed, you spend from when the budget gets passed, April, to when 421A expires, June, fighting over killing 421A and what we want to use that money for in the future. So that's I guess, how I would answer the question.
Great, and on to our last question to close out is Lee.
Yeah, hi, Sam. Thank you so much for your presentation. I understand the focus on planners and planning, but we can't all be planners, and it's quite complex. And sometimes, so a lot of us have been involved in big struggles. I live in Williamsburg and started with the 197A plan in the late 90s and went all the way through that. We thought we'd won. We got to the point where we thought we'd won. And now there's a wall of glass owned by rich people in front of us. And I think that for the rest of us, that the idea that if we just refine the planning enough, we'll be able to win. And I think we have to, name the enemy. We have to say, oh yeah, real estate money is the poison in New York City politics. But who is that? We have to point that out. We have to bell the cat. And I don't think we do enough of that. Seems like everybody's progressive. And then at the end, the real estate money gets in and gets their way. Well, how do they do that? Who did that? Where did they do it? Who let them do that? To me, those are the kinds of things that the rest of us need to know so we can be on the right side and help the organizers accomplish what they need to accomplish. And I'm wondering if you have any insight on how we do that, because they're all faceless, nameless people who get their way.
Wow. I mean, I think you've made a very good case for it right there. I think that's what the work that I tried to do, or that the work that I do tries to do, in terms of naming the system, in terms of naming the players. Sometimes I think it's very effective to just show some of the personalities, that it's not just, you know, capital moving like you know, metal and magnets from one place to another, but there are people doing this. You know, Doug often talks about his friend Bob Fitch, who wrote about this stuff very clearly and named names along the way. I think that that's a good model. But to end where you started, you said we can't all be planners. And I think I know what you mean. And obviously you were involved in the 187A plan, 197A. And that didn't work in Williamsburg, it was crushed. But like, the socialist idea is that, yes, we will all be planners, that we will own this all together, and that we will plan it democratically, and that we will do this thing, and that we have the power to do it. We have the skill to do it. We have the means to do it. We need, you know, we need to take the power. We have the potential power we don't have. So I don't want to give up on the idea of everybody as a planner. I think that's ultimately what we're working toward. And I also don't want to give up on the idea of planning. I really think that that's what we need. I think that planners have given planning such a bad name that some of us on the left have turned against planning because we don't like what planners have done, or because we don't like capitalist planning. I don't like capitalist planning either, but I absolutely believe that planning is the only way that we can turn the world in a different direction than the market and the capitalists are turning. So thank you all for inviting me. It's good to see some friends here.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was awesome. I think it leaves a lot of food for thought from people, and a great Q&A. So thank you to everyone for being active and for asking great questions. Do not leave the call yet. We have some very important announcements for you, so don't even think about exiting out. And then we will give you some exciting upcoming events and actions to plug yourself into that is related to housing and others. Importantly, if you enjoyed this night school session, please come for the next one. It's in 2 weeks. It's going to be on healthcare and socialism with Natalie Schur. She's also a great speaker. Really excited to have her talk on the subject. So go ahead and click that link, just RSVP, add it to your Google Calendar, even if you're not sure. We would love to have you there. And if you are joining us for the first time, if you're a new member, if this is your first political ed event, anything like that, please feel free to reach out to North Brooklyn. I'm part of the organizing committee for NBK as well. So we love to talk to new people. If you have any questions about how to get involved, how to learn more about any working group or issue that you want to organize around, please feel free to email us. Next, we do, in terms of local strike support and labor, there's an ongoing strike at United Metro Energy. We would love to have your support there. And their picket line is every Tuesday at 500 Kingsland Ave in Greenpoint, 9 to 10 a.m. It's a different time from before, so just note that. And if you can't show up, please consider helping them out with the strike fund that they are circulating. And I believe we had a working group representative here to talk about housing's next meeting.
Yes, absolutely. That's me. Yes. So we're meeting next Monday at 7 p.m. Monday 7th at 7. Easy to remember. And we're going to be talking about, you know, how to fight. That's the plug I'm going to give. And we also have, I'm pretty excited about this polyed meeting coming up on Sunday. I'm going to put both of these links in the chat. But that polyed meeting is kind of, we're trying to think about like, okay, from like, you know, Giuliani and Dinkins, there was this kind of idea of like a revanchist city, like the city was being used basically to you know, beat on people. The city was being used to Yeah, Neil Smith, he's great. And so like, what's that revanchism happening now? We see this big, Eric Adams has this big plan to, I don't know, like, throw the cops on a bunch of homeless people, I think is what it's coming down to. And how do we understand that revanchism, and how do we understand that in the context of housing and kind of like the, small homeowner, like reactionaries who are like really against the eviction moratorium and really against tenants? How do we understand this political moment we're all in? So we have a planning meeting for that on Sunday, and we're going to be doing an event on that sometime in the future. But please come out to our meeting. Please, organize with your neighbors. Please come to our canvases. Anything we do, you should come out to. They're all fun. And I'm going to drop the links in the chat.
Thank you, Isaac. And do we have someone from NYCHA Solidarity Working Group to announce their meeting? If not, we can follow up and provide the links afterwards. The other quick announcements was just, if you're not already a DSA member, please go ahead and join DSA. If you're not convinced, reach out to us, email, we're happy to have a conversation. And you can also sign up for chapter dues, which is additional funding for important things like an office, for our campaigns, for staff. So please do that as well. And you can contact our political ed committee at this email if you guys have feedback, suggestions, questions, anything like that. And I'll toss it back to Steve to close out.
Thank you, Mia, and thank you, Sam. Thank you all who came. Let's go out there and kick ass and take numbers. Have a good night.